The Nazis built a jet fighter factory inside a mountain. Not beside it, not under a camouflage net, inside the rock itself. Tunnels ran for miles through the sandstone. Concrete bunkers sat at the base of the slope. And across the flattened summit, they laid a runway more than 1,000 meters long. The plan was to build the Messerschmitt Me 262, one of the first operational jet fighters in the world, somewhere Allied bombers could not easily destroy. But the site had a problem that sounds almost made up. The aircraft were assembled below. The runway was above. So when a fighter was finished, it had to be hauled up the slope and launched from the summit in a way that left no room for error and no way back. This was supposed to help save Nazi Germany's air war. Instead, thousands of forced laborers were consumed by one of the strangest industrial failures of the Second World War. The real question is not why they built it. It is why they kept building it after it could no longer change the war. In April 1945, American soldiers reached the hill and discovered what had been hidden inside. In the second week of April 1945, infantry in the American 89th Division, part of Patton's Third Army, pushed toward a wooded sandstone hill outside a small Thuringian town called Kahla. The guards were already gone. What the soldiers found instead was a factory built into the rock. Tunnels ran back into the dark. A row of concrete bunkers stood at the foot of the slope, with fighter aircraft inside them in various stages of assembly. And when the men looked up, they saw a runway laid clear across the summit. They had been warned to expect a fight. They had not been warned to expect this. The place was called REIMAHG, a name stitched together from the title of its patron, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. In the files, it carried the code word Lachs, salmon, part of the regime's habit of giving underground factories fish names. But to understand why an entire hill had been hollowed out and capped with a runway, you have to go back about a year, to the moment the German air war began to come apart. At the center of the whole project was a single aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262. To the crews of the Allied bombers, it looked like the future arriving early. Powered by 2 jet engines, it flew around 540 miles an hour, perhaps 100 faster than the propeller fighters escorting them, and carried 4 heavy 30mm cannons in the nose. It could seem to appear from nowhere, tear through a formation, and be gone before the escorts could react. The Me 262 deserves its reputation, but not the legend that has grown up around it. It was not a magic weapon. It was a brilliant aircraft, trapped inside a dying war machine. Its engines needed heat-resistant metals that Germany by 1944 barely had. The substitutes burned out fast, and an engine pushed too hard could destroy itself on takeoff. It needed pilots trained to handle something that behaved nothing like a propeller fighter. At the very moment the Luftwaffe was losing experienced men faster than it could replace them, with too little fuel to train the rest. A superior machine is of no use to an air force that has run out of fuel to fly it, and the men to fly it well. By 1945, Germany was running out of both. And yet the regime was about to pour a fortune in labor and lives into building this fighter underground. To see why, you have to look at what Allied bombers had just done to German industry. By early 1944, German aircraft plants were being bombed faster than they could be repaired. During a single week of concentrated raids, the Allies called it Big Week. American and British bombers hit the airframe factories hard enough to make one lesson obvious. Anything built in the open could be destroyed from the air. Speer's Armaments Ministry responded by creating an emergency body, the Jägerstab, or Fighter Staff, ordered to force fighter production back up by any means necessary. Its answer was simple and extreme. Bury the factories underground. Thuringia offered what the program needed. It was central, harder to reach repeatedly from the air, and full of old mine workings. At Kahla, the planners found the Walpersburg, a flat-topped sandstone hill already cut through with some 20 kilometers of tunnels, dug over decades to supply the local porcelain trade. To the regime, it looked like a shortcut. They would turn the hill into a machine for building fighters. The region had one more thing the project needed. It fell within the domain of Fritz Zalko, the Nazi official responsible for dragging millions of forced laborers into the Reich. For a scheme like this, that mattered more than almost anything else. The regime had the tunnels, it had the ambition, and through Sauckel's labor system, it had people it was willing to spend. But the hill was not going to dig itself. The Walpersburg was not turned into a factory by engineering alone. It was turned into one by forced labor, prisoners, deported workers, and starving people from across occupied Europe. More than 12,000 people were brought to Kahla. The total who passed through the works came close to 15,000. And they were not finishing a factory that had already been prepared for them. They were digging the tunnels, pouring the bunkers, and throwing up their own barracks all at once. While Berlin demanded aircraft, the site was nowhere near ready to produce. Many of the camps were barely camps at all. Unfinished huts and improvised shelters scattered across the hillsides, some never completed before the war ended. The first to arrive in the spring of 1944 were Italian soldiers, men who, after Italy surrendered the previous autumn, had refused to keep fighting for the Axis and had been interned as prisoners. At first, there was no place to put them, so they were packed into the cleared ballroom of a Kahla restaurant while the barracks went up around them. After them came the others, Frenchmen, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, Dutch workers seized in labor roundups, and concentration camp prisoners moved in from the Buchenwald system to the north. Whole families were swept up in it, women and children included. Among them was an 11-year-old Polish boy named Jan Stech. While his father and brother worked in the tunnels, he looked after his 3-year-old sister and begged for food in the villages around the hill. Inside the workings, the conditions were lethal and close. Poor light, sandstone dust thick in the air, wet passages crowded with cables, timber props, and machinery forced underground before the tunnels were ready for it. Men were worked past exhaustion on too little food, and hunger, disease, accidents in the rock, and beatings did the rest. The engineering was impressive. The method was criminal. And after all of it, all the digging, all the dying, the work still did not function the way it was meant to. The grand vision, a vast assembly line deep inside the hill, turning out fighters by the hundred, never arrived. The tunnels weren't finished in time, so the work was improvised. Components were built and partly assembled underground, then hauled back out to the concrete bunkers at the foot of the slope where the aircraft were put together in the open air the whole scheme had been designed to avoid. The strangest part was not inside the hill. It was above it. The assembly bunkers were at the bottom. The runway was on top. So each completed May 262 was loaded onto a cradle and dragged up the steep face of the Walpersburg on an inclined hoist, hauled up the slope like freight to reach the strip on the summit. Even then, the runway was too short for a jet to get airborne under its own power. So the aircraft were fitted for rocket-assisted takeoff and launched from a strip that left no margin for error. The strip was also far too short to land on, which meant that once a fighter left the summit, it could never come back. Every takeoff was final, and the aircraft that did get away weren't even finished. They had to be flown to another site, roughly 100 kilometers away, simply to have their guns and radios fitted and tested, because the works could not complete its own product. Which leaves the only question that really matters. After all of that, did it actually work? The plan was a production schedule written for a war Germany was no longer capable of fighting. More than 1,000 May 262s a month. 40 a day. An underground works pumping fighters onto the summit faster than any conventional factory in Germany. It never became that. The tunnels stayed unfinished. The assembly line never ran as designed. The aircraft had to be completed outside, dragged uphill, and launched from a strip that gave them no way back. And after all of it, the final count was not 1,000 a month. It was somewhere between 17 and 27 aircraft. In total. The arithmetic is the whole story. By the time even those few were flying, the number of aircraft had stopped being Germany's real problem. The oil was gone. The railways were breaking apart. Whole fronts were dissolving. There was no fuel to fly the fighters, and no longer enough trained pilots to send up the ones that flew. The Reich had carved a plant into a hill, laid a runway across the top of it, and hauled jet fighters up the slope to launch them into the sky. And it had almost nothing to show for it. What the arithmetic leaves out is the cost. No one can give the exact number, and that's part of the story. The groups who research and tend the site today commemorate around 2,000 dead. Some estimates run as high as 3,000. The number that can be named with certainty is smaller, because in the chaos of the Reich's final weeks, no one was keeping an honest count. Set against 17 to 27 aircraft, the figure needs no underlining. When the Americans reached the hill, one last irony was waiting for them. The factory had never been bombed. British reconnaissance had photographed aircraft at the site a month earlier. The Allies knew it was there. They had simply never needed to destroy it, because the ground war reached the mountain first. American intelligence teams moved in fast. The May 262 was advanced enough that they wanted everything they could learn from it. They took what they could haul away: airframes, parts, drawings, and the German engineers who understood them, before the region passed to the Soviet zone that summer. Within 2 years, the new occupiers had blown the bunkers and tunnel mouths shut and stripped the runway from the summit. The forest came back over the rock. The aircraft are gone, the runway is gone, the machinery is gone. But every year in the villages around Walpersburg, the names of the dead are still read aloud. That is the real legacy of the hill. Not the aircraft, not the runways, not the tunnels, the names. If you enjoy carefully researched stories like this, subscribe for more history documentaries every week.